guys, thanks for coming back to my channel. I've got a book review for you today, and that book is The Ghost Tree by Christina Henry. As you can see, I have really read the crap out of it because the front of the cover is all bent up. But anyway, let's get started into the review. What is this book about? Well, The Ghost Tree takes place in mid-1980s United States in a small-ish town / suburb maybe of Chicago. Anyway, it focuses around a young girl named Lauren, and Lauren is 14 years old, almost 15 years old, and it's the summer before she starts high school. Now, fun fact about Lauren, her dad was horribly murdered the November before, and so we kind of are introduced to her as she's walking in the woods towards the ghost tree to meet her best friend. And we find out that her father was murdered and that his heart was ripped out, and he was discovered in the forest not too far from the ghost tree. As the story progresses, we start to find out that there's some very, very strange things about this little town that Lauren lives in. And it turns out that there is another murder that same day. In fact, it's a double murder where two girls who were presumably hiking in those very same woods were slaughtered, their bodies were dragged into a neighbor's backyard and dismembered, and they were beheaded, and then from there, spooky, crazy, occult stuff starts happening in this small town. But the really crazy thing is that after these bodies are discovered, within a few hours, maybe even by the next day, people in the town start forgetting that it even happened. And that's where the real mystery begins. Why did I choose The Ghost Tree by Christina Henry? Well, there's nothing scientific about my choice here. I was looking for dark fantasy or horror that came out in 2020, and this one happened to come out a few weeks before I started my online search. When I read the back jacket, I thought it sounded pretty intriguing, and it sounded like something that was right up my alley. And then a lot of reviews online had some great things to say about Christina Henry's earlier work, which were mostly, it seems like they were adaptations of classic fairy tales. So what are some things that I liked about this book? Well, it was incredibly fast-paced. The chapters are actually really, really short, and it's definitely what a lot of people would call a page-turner. You can get through a chapter really quickly, and it makes it easy for you to jump in and out of the book if you don't have a lot of time to read. That being said, I was very much hooked on the book, especially for like the first third of it. And I didn't want to put it down. The way that the chapters are set up makes it almost feel very cinematic. You have lots of different point of view characters in this book, not just Lauren, but as I said, there's also a police officer in town, Lauren's best friend Miranda, and a few other folks are peppered in there for good measure. And even though there are a lot of different POV characters and it jumps around a lot from different perspectives, it's not hard to follow because the story is very much linear. And also I think that the writer, Christina Henry, did a really good job on each POV chapter making them seem distinct. So this book is written from a third person's perspective. I can't say that word. Perspective. Third person perspective. So even though this book is written from a third person perspective, the author does a really good job of when she's jumping into those different POV chapters, making each chapter feel unique to whoever that point of view character is at the time. And so I thought that that was really masterfully done. Now for some things that I did not like about this book, and there were more than a few. So the first thing is going to be definitely like my personal preference. In fact, there are some people who I've looked at their reviews of this book online, and they specifically mentioned that they really, really like the thing I'm about to bring up, but I was not a fan of this. This book suffers from a lot of navel gazing. And what I mean by that is there's almost too much character internal dialogue, too much introspection. There was just a lot of internal thought that Lauren and other characters were having that felt very like explainy without progressing the plot along very much. This was particularly the case in the last third of the book. The first third, it wasn't so bad, or maybe I didn't notice it as much, but by the time I got towards the end, I was really getting tired of it. Like, for example, there's multiple chapters where Lauren would be, thinking through things, having a conversation with herself in her head, and the author would be narrating this, and then it would jump to italics, and Lauren would be thinking in her own head and having these thoughts, and that was pretty clear how that was happening. And then the next line in parentheses would be more italics, where she's almost talking back and forth with herself. I found this very off-putting. I did not like this device at all. It really pulled me out of the story. I kind of found it boring. Also, for people with learning disabilities or who have dyslexia, who have trouble reading different types of fonts, this is going to be kind of a nightmare to get through. This definitely does not apply universally, but I think that there are some people who, when you jump from like a Times New Roman or Calibri or Arial or whatever, and then you go into italics, that like your brain will be on a nice flow, and then all of a sudden there's a hiccup. And then again, when you have like italics going on within parentheses, that's going to be another like thing that is going to cause you to have to transition and retrain your brain into what you're reading in the dialogue. Now, to be clear, that was not the reason I didn't like it. I thought that the quantity of this internal dialogue, the quantity of everything in italics, it was just too much. I found it kind of boring. But as I mentioned earlier, there are some people who quite enjoyed this, and I'll link to Max Reed's review of this book. He actually, I think, liked this. So definitely, my opinion, take it with a grain of salt. It was just something that I did not like about this book. Also, I didn't need like 3 whole pages of Lauren talking about having her first period. Like, I get it. It's traumatic. I remember when I had my first period, it wasn't fun, but I don't need to read 3 whole pages about it. Let's staple that up, throw a pad on, maybe toss a tampon up there, and let's move on with the rest of the story, shall we? I feel like Christina Henry was very self-aware that she was maybe doing this a lot more with Lauren than with other characters, because the way she wrote her character made Lauren seem like she was, the type of woman, girl who lived a lot in her own head, who maybe thought about things a lot before she said them, who processed things very slowly internally. And this becomes apparent in her interactions with a potential love interest in the book named Jake. And Jake says like, hey, where'd you go? Or who are you talking to in there? So I think that the fact that the author did this was very intentional. I just didn't really like it or find it that interesting. One other small thing that kind of pulled me out of the book is I figured out the twist way too early. We've kind of all been trained to do that by now, to expect that there's going to be a twist. So I think Christina Henry rightly put like a little bit of twist in there, or was kind of dropping breadcrumbs to maybe lead us down a false path. Unfortunately, I figured out the twist way too early, and I don't know if it was just I was looking too hard to find it, or if maybe she didn't do a good enough job trying to distract me from it. One other thing that I think is not anything that the author did, but I think the blame for this lays at the feet of the editors of this book. There were passages and sentences that seemed like they all should have been in italics, but then they swapped back and forth from italics to sort of the standard font. And it was just like, maybe I think I caught an error that the editors made towards the end where they weren't consistent with the italics. Again, problem would have been solved by having probably half the amount of italics in the book. But again, this is just me kind of complaining. Maybe I'm the asshole. I've never published a book. You let me know in the comments. Am I the asshole here? Probably. It's a safe bet that I am the asshole. The very last thing that I'll say, and this is super nitpicky and probably only specific to someone like me, there was one instance at the end of the book where in a fight scene, the author describes someone as delivering a roundhouse punch. And I was like, what's a roundhouse punch? Like, I've done martial arts for a long time. I like to watch a lot of like fighting. It's something I enjoy. And I've never heard a haymaker described as a roundhouse punch. I've definitely heard of a roundhouse kick. So I actually put down the book because I was like, wow, like, am I just like behind on my terminology and in like different techniques? So I put down the book. I Googled roundhouse punch. Indeed, I think it is a haymaker because some people like explained that maybe the terms could be synonymous. And I was like, well, why didn't you just say haymaker? Like, everybody knows what a haymaker is. And then I was like, no, Rachel, you're being a dickhead. Not everybody knows what a haymaker is, but everybody can probably, like, visualize what a roundhouse punch is, even though I don't know anyone who would call it a roundhouse punch. Maybe it's a regionalism, I don't know. But yeah, that was one thing where I was like, this is why it's important for authors to do their research. And she probably did do her research and was like, if I say haymaker, most people are not going to know what that is. But if I describe what the movement is, they'll probably understand what I'm trying to describe in this fight scene. So I think most people would not have even noticed this or cared, but it was something that pulled me out of the book. But anyway, that's because I'm a dork, and as we've already established in the review, I am the asshole here. Moving right along. So who do I think would like this book? Well, I think if you're looking for a very fast-paced, fast-clip horror story, let me retract that. Dark fantasy, perhaps a retelling of a fairy tale type story. I think you'll like this a lot. If you're fans of her other work, then you're probably also really going to like this. Also, if you're looking for a little 80s nostalgia and you don't want to rewatch Stranger Things again, consider picking up this book. It does take place in the mid-1980s, and that's kind of fun. And I wouldn't say it's a ripoff of Stranger Things at all, because the character perspectives are very different, the plot is incredibly different, and it has just an overall different feel and atmosphere. But if you're looking for that 80s nostalgia, this, I think, will hit all the buttons for you. I also think if you are a fan of contemporary dark fantasy and you want a female protagonist who isn't necessarily like your Buffy the Vampire Slayer, kick-ass, badass female protagonist, but a character who's very much coming into their power, I think that you'll enjoy the way Lauren is presented in this story. So how would I rank this book? Well, I think Christina Henry's writing style definitely worked with my brain, and so I enjoyed reading her prose. It wasn't a chore at all. Also, I was eager to come back to it after I put it down, especially in the first half. I thought the story was relatively original, and even though I caught the twist a little early, I didn't think that it was a predictable story at all. One thing I'll say that I really liked about this book is that it left me wanting more. I hope that Christina Henry entertains the idea of maybe seeing what happens to Lauren 5 years down the road. What's going to happen to Lauren in her small town when she gets to college age? How do the things that Lauren discovers about herself affect her future relationships? Does she stay living in the small town, or when she grows up, does she move away, and what kind of adventures does she encounter there? So I definitely got invested in the characters of Lauren and the part that her small town played in the story overall. And finally, another thing that's going to affect how I would rate this book is whether or not it encouraged me to want to read more by this author. And I've got to say, no. I'm not probably going to go out of my way to read any more of Christina Henry's books, even though I did find myself becoming very heavily invested in the characters and the story. I think I'm wrapped up here. I've got a lot of other things on my to-do list, and I did not love it enough to want to go out and get one of her earlier books, nor will I be hungrily awaiting her next publication. So overall, I give this book 3 out of 5 spooky trees. Have you read this book? How would you rate it? Let me know if you have some differing opinions. Maybe you loved it a lot more than I did, and that's totally cool because there are literally thousands of people out there writing books, so there's something out there for everyone to enjoy. But for me, this one was kind of a it's okay. Now for one last thing, where would I put this book on the scary scale? I've decided going forward that whenever I read horror, I'm going to rate them on Rachel's personal scary scale, which I have basically stolen the Scoville scale with which we rate hot things, and I'm just going to apply it here. So on the scale of mayonnaise to ghost pepper, how scary would I say this horror book is? Well, not very scary. I would rank this as maybe freshly ground pepper that you would put on a regular old bland white people ass dinner. If you're not scared just by descriptions of dismembered body parts, you're not going to find this book scary. I would hesitate to even call this horror, but you gotta put it somewhere, and more people understand the concept of what a horror book is than the concept of maybe a dark fantasy book. This is much more of a dark fantasy book. I would put Christina Henry on the shelf next to Neil Gaiman before I would put her on the shelf next to Stephen King. Thanks, guys, for joining me on this journey as I talked about Christina Henry's The Ghost Tree. Please let me know in the comments down below if you have read this book and what you thought about it. If you've read some of her other stuff and you think that I should stop being such a jackass and go read her other things, let me know. But until I see you next time, have a great holiday season, and as always, go read a book.